mingle a little bit. Thanks very much for coming along. Thanks very much to Annie and to Rory for helping out with the, Annie for inviting me and Rory for helping out with the tech. As Annie said, I produce a sonic arts project called Disinformation, primarily concerned with electricity, communications and language. I've been doing it for 30 years, which is kind of slightly alarming, but anyway. So electricity, communications and language, what that means in practice is a lot of stuff to do with electromagnetism, radio interference, very low frequency radio, but also stuff to do with audio-visual illusions, and more recently stuff to do with kind of philosophy of language and things like that. This particular talk, that people always like new things, right? But this is a talk that I've been giving for 25 years. The first, I've given 50 Rorschach audio talks. The first one was at the Royal Society of Sculptors, no less, weirdly, in 2000. In 2001, a previously sketchy version of the Rorschach audio blurb that I published in a year previously was sort of souped up, tidied up, submitted to a MIT Press journal, peer-reviewed by leading academics, and published by, as I said, the MIT Press, and that kind of launched Rorschach audio as being a sort of, I don't know about intellectually respectable, is that the right word? I don't know. I was on the dole in Tooting, and I submitted a paper to an academic journal, and it got accepted and published. Largely as a result of that, in 2007, I applied for funding from the AHRC to pursue Rorschach audio research project at Goldsmiths. And so from 2007 to 2012, it was kind of formally adopted as a kind of major AHRC funded research project, and which resulted in the publication of the book Rorschach Audio, Art and Illusion for Sound. The kind of subtitle, the sort of meaning of the subtitle will become apparent during the talk. I think there are some copies of this in the LCC library, so check it out. Okay, so thanks very much. I'll talk for about an hour, and then there's lots of clips in the part of the demonstration, so it's not just the sound of my voice. And maybe have some questions and stuff afterwards. Okay. Okay. There is a perception, particularly amongst contemporary art critics and arts commentators, but also amongst members of the public, that sound art is a relatively new art form. Of course, the truth is that sounds produced by voices are among the earliest raw materials ever subjected to any form of creative manipulation. Speech itself is an art form, and therefore poetry and literature of the oral tradition are, alongside music, the oldest forms of sound art, and probably the oldest art forms, period. On that basis, it can be on that basis, it can be argued that far from being a marginal or in any way difficult art form, sound art is instead the most primal, the most pervasive, and arguably the earliest form of creative art. The argument put forward in my book, Rorschach Audio, is that, paraphrasing Aristotle's Poetics, since written language is based on symbolic visual representations of individual sounds, by which he meant letters, the earliest form of sound recording technology was not, as it's generally presumed, any form of machine, but was in fact written language. Alongside literature and poetry of the oral tradition, even written literature and poetry are therefore forms of sound art. So, when one considers music, poetry, literature, theatrical dialogue, theatrical sound effects, and architectural acoustics, and particularly also sound design for contemporary cinema and for computer games, it can be argued that in its various diverse and widespread manifestations, sound art is one of, if not the most mainstream and commercially important of cultural commodities. Sound art is not a niche art form by any stretch of the imagination.
By way of illustration, the art of designing theatre sound effects is, for instance, quite clearly a form of sound art, which goes back at least as far as those architects whose expertise ensured that the proverbial pin could be heard dropping throughout the auditoria of ancient Greek amphitheatres. As regards specifically British history, the theatre historian Robert Mott describes how since Shakespearean days, a popular method for creating illusions of thunder in theatre shows involved, quote, a cannonball rolling down a trough and falling onto a huge drum. Robert Mott states that, quote, some people were not pleased with this cumbersome technique, so in 1708, long before the invention of modern sound art, so to speak, the dramatist John Dennis designed an alternative thunder effect for his play Appius and Virginia at the Drury Lane Theatre in London. John Dennis, quote, invented something much more realistic and controllable, a large piece of thin copper sheeting suspended from a frame by wires. Quote, the thunder sheet was a great success, and as a result other stage productions began using this effect. This infuriated John Dennis to the point where he would angrily confront the offending producer by charging, you, sir, are stealing my thunder. Dennis is also said to have stated that is my thunder, by God, the villains will play my thunder but not my play. And what this anecdote provides is not just another example of, so to speak, early sound art, of sonic art that predates contemporary fine arts practice by 200 years, but also potentially of the earliest recorded instance of what amounts to an intellectual property dispute between sound artists. This dispute was in fact so important that the phrase stealing my thunder has for hundreds of years been immortalised as a very common figure of speech in the English language. I guess it's pretty obvious what I'm trying to say there. Sonic art goes back to the evolution of speech itself. The fact that despite such histories, sonic art is not generally perceived to be a mainstream art form has arguably a great deal to do with the phenomena of psychology of perception, and it's the psychology of perception of audible speech which forms the central focus of the Rorschach Audio research project. Rorschach Audio starts as a critique of so-called electronic voice phenomena research. EVP is a belief system whose followers believe they're able to literally record the voices of ghosts, and as the demonstrations that you're about to experience show, the misperception of stray radio and communications chatter as ghost voices stems from misinterpretations of psychoacoustic phenomena. EVP practitioners misperceive voices they've recorded because those voices are sufficiently ambiguous, and because the beliefs EVP followers attach to those perceptions are sufficiently strong to produce illusions of sound which can be, if not objectively convincing, at least emotionally appealing. As well as demonstrating intriguing auditory phenomena, this talk is relevant to sonic arts because so many, often high-profile sound artists work with EVP. For reasons that I've never fully understood, EVP is extremely popular in sonic art circles. But also because the ideas presented in this talk link to an individual generally recognised as the most historically important Western artist, and because they link to what is arguably the most important work of visual arts theory ever published. So, to recap, electronic voice phenomena are a class of allegedly mysterious vocal recordings, and while several explanations have been offered to explain their origin, the vast majority of EVP researchers believe that their recordings constitute physical evidence of contact with the afterlife. In other words, these researchers mostly believe that it's possible, using various radio and electrical engineering techniques, to literally record the voices of ghosts. The inventors Edison and Marconi both believed in the possibility that radio technology might enable contact with the afterlife, and this idea sits well in context of Victorian enthusiasm for various forms of spiritualism. But the EVP movement proper began in 1957, when Friedrich Jürgensen, an artist who painted portraits of Pope Pius XII, found voices intruding on recordings he'd made of his own voice and of birdsong. Convinced that these recordings represented communications from aliens and from his deceased mother, Jürgensen temporarily abandoned his artistic career to concentrate on these experiments and to publicize his findings. He wrote 3 books between 1960 and 1968. From 1968 onwards, Jorgensen cemented an increasingly close relationship with the Vatican, making a number of documentary films about religious themes and executing portrait commissions for Pope Paul VI. Jorgensen's books, and particularly the idea that he'd amassed evidence proving the existence of the afterlife, attracted media attention. Another soon-to-be EVP researcher, Konstantin Raudive, took up the cause of EVP research, allegedly making tens of thousands of recordings. Through the publication of Raudive's book Breakthrough in 1971, Raudive became the leading light in an international circle of EVP enthusiasts. And today, the movement that Jorgensen and Raudive effectively founded has evolved into a widespread activity of such complexity that it would be difficult for anyone to attempt a truly comprehensive survey. If you look online, there's an absolutely enormous amount of EVP stuff. If you watch graveyard shift channels on TV, there are loads and loads of ghost hunting programs, of which EVP is a recurrent feature. So EVP is becoming increasingly embedded in kind of popular culture and is often presented to the general public as a plausible form of genuine science. The purpose of this talk is not to attempt a survey of the EVP movement, but to address the major salient issues which recur throughout EVP research and which in fact underpin the entire belief system. My own first exposure to EVP was hearing a flexi disc of voices recorded by Konstantin Raudive, which was published about 1982 in the Unexplained magazine, which was one of these kind of magazines that had kind of articles about UFOs and Bigfoot and stuff like that in it. The style is, I'll play you in a second. The style of these recordings is typical of EVP. A narrator introduces ghost contact, a narrator with a particularly strident and intimidating sort of vocal style, introduces ghost contacts which manifests as brief bursts of distorted voice accompanied by very high levels of radio interference and machine noise picked up from the tape recording machine by a microphone. The examples are repeated several times and the ambience of the recordings is menacing. My initial reaction to hearing this material was one of disbelief, because in addition to my own instinctive skepticism about any claim to the existence of the supernatural, outright forgery of such material would be absolute child's play, as I'm sure anybody who's kind of like, messed around with kind of recording equipment would be very, very easy to actually fake this kind of stuff. The most primitive tape recording and overdubbing techniques could easily produce recordings of this nature. Not least, but this is where it perhaps a little bit more interesting, not least because the more basic the technology used, the more the finished product would resonate with an aura of menacing low fidelity mystique, which can, paradoxically, help lend a subjective impression of authenticity to such material. This is quite an interesting point. Some people have described the phenomenon of kind of like deliberately adding noise to old recordings as a form of the phrase audio camouflage has been used. You can kind of age audio recordings in a similar way that you might age a painting if you were involved in forging pictures. If the voices recorded were of similar quality to conventional studio recordings of speech, then nobody would have believed in the ghost voices for a minute. So, one of the paradoxes of EVP is that even though the material's not very convincing, it's actually more convincing because it's bad quality. If somebody came to you and said, I've got a crystal clear recording of your own grandmother who passed away 5 years ago, and I made this using, radio technology yesterday, and they played you a crystal clear recording, you wouldn't, you would just instantly assume that they were kind of trying to insult you, But, the fact that the recordings are of such poor quality actually encourages people to suspend disbelief just a little bit. I don't know if I'm putting that very well, but anyway, it's a kind of interesting paradox of the kind of quality issue. However, having said all that, I will also describe why I now believe that some EVP researchers have perfectly genuine motives. They're not actually faking this material, and that many of the signals that they've recorded are not consciously faked, but are instead commonplace and physically real material phenomena, but phenomena whose origin and nature they've misunderstood. So let's have some examples.
A text spoken by the voices and the sound volume are exactly the same as in the original recording. To help the ear adapt itself to the strange rhythm, rapidity and softness of the voice entity's speech, each utterance is repeated several times. The voices here selected are grouped according to the persons addressed and their respective answers, followed by a translation and explanation. They are examples chosen to give the reader a breakthrough, an acoustic illustration of the material presented in the book. The listener is asked to read any text spoken in languages he does not know with particular attention, so that he may be able to grasp each separate word phonetically. Please note the commentary that goes with each voice text, as the meaning of some utterances can only be understood in context with the situation that gave rise to them.
The first voice is that of Margarete Petrowski, who had told the experimenter during her lifetime that she did not believe in an existence after death.
One of the interesting things about this recording is that even if you don't really believe in the kind of hypothesis that's being put forward, particularly that woman's voice is so strident and sort of piercing, that if you're listening to stuff like this, you do kind of get the impression, on a slightly comical level perhaps, but do kind of get the impression that this original vinyl recording does convey the impression that you're sort of participating in a seance of some sort, even if you're not really a believer. And I think her kind of vocal presentation style is a big factor in that.
Her passing, the experimenter asked her how she felt in the beyond, and a voice, identified as coming from Margarete, answered, "Bedenke, ich bin." German, imagine, I am. Again we hear Margarete Petrowski's voice, this time calling her former employer, Dr. Zenta Maurina. Zenta. Now the experimenter asks if Margarete can hear him, and a voice replies, "Kostja, ja." German, Kostja, yes. The voice then calls the experimenter's family name, Raudive, but shortens it to Raudiv. And now we hear in Latvian and German, Koste, tu tik na. Koste, you are so near. Now the experimenter calls the Russian poet Vladimir Mayakovsky, and a voice answers, Mayakovsky. The experimenter tells the poet how difficult it is to convince people of the reality of the voice phenomenon, and in reply comes a statement which is typical for Mayakovsky's personality. Konstantin, pluj. In Russian, Konstantin, spit on it.
There you go. There's a lot of that kind of material. So the idea that EVP could be described as an authentic phenomenon and that explanations do exist for how they arise is drawn from a number of sources. The neurologist Oliver Sacks discusses acoustic projection in his book Seeing Voices, quoting descriptions of the, quote, eye music and phantasmal voices experienced by the South African poet David Wright in his autobiographical book Deafness. Having lost his sense of hearing in childhood after the onset of spoken language, David Wright found himself able to experience reconstructed sound images projected by his mind into his perceived environment as an extension of visual information. So, lip reading triggered actual voices inside David Wright's head, despite the fact that no environmental sound was being provided by his ears. The projecting effect was in fact so strong that David Wright even reports hearing ghost sounds conjured by the motion of trees in wind. David Wright's faculties may sound extraordinary, but what I hope to demonstrate now is that his experiences are extreme manifestations of a capacity for projection that not only manifests in all senses, in all people, able-bodied or otherwise, but which also influences the whole process of perception. A psychoacoustics demonstration known as the McGurk effect, for instance, refers to an experiment in which volunteers were asked to describe what they heard after watching videos of a face reading monosyllables. The sounds that the test subjects heard were modified by the visual information provided by the face, the film of the guy speaking. When the video was dubbed, so that the face says gar, but the voice is replaced with the sound bar, listeners described hearing the syllable dar. So the face says gar, the sound is removed and replaced with another recording that says bar. What listeners hear is neither of those, but in fact dar, which is acoustically midway between gar and bar. Right? This I'll play you in a second. It's a kind of slightly bizarre looking demonstration. Let me get this right.
Arbeiten.
Bob.
Okay, it's a slightly bizarre looking demonstration, but the point at which it becomes most interesting, I think, is that you realise that the sound that you hear in your mind changes according to whether your eyes are open or closed, whether your eyes are open or closed. So, experiment with that while you're listening to the recording.
Ba 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 ba. Ba 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 ba.
So, any feedback from that one? Yeah. Yep, I'm getting some nodding, but yeah. So what you have is that the replacement soundtrack, when you have a blank screen and just the audio, the replacement soundtrack is accurately heard as the syllable bar. When you see the face on screen, lip reading causes you to then mishear that bar syllable as dar. The original face was filmed producing the sound gar. So to reiterate, the sound changes slightly depending on whether your eyes are open or closed. Among wartime experiences described in his autobiographical novel, The Periodic Table,
The former anti-fascist partisan Primo Levi recalled a laboratory test apparatus called a heterodyne, which under certain conditions functions as a radio. He described, quote, an intricate universe of mysterious messages, Morse tickings, modulated hisses, deformed, mangled voices which pronounce sentences in incomprehensible languages or in code, messages of death, the radiophonic babel of war. And it's perhaps not surprising that studies of this confusing sound world also provide useful clues to help understand the enigma of EVP. Oliver Rainier and Vladimir Rubinstein's book A Sign to Listen, for instance, also states, as with David Wright, that, quote, the mechanism of projection plays a major part in hearing. Their book describes the so-called ether war fought by BBC foreign language radio monitors who scanned the Second World War's, quote, remorseless sea of noises for the broken voices, coded messages, news, propaganda, disinformation and entertainment broadcasts that fought for bandwidth with the incessant vagaries of ionospheric propagation and the turbulence of electrical and magnetic storms. The wartime BBC radio monitors recorded often already weak signals onto primitive Ediphone wax cylinder transcribers, like before magnetic audio tape was introduced after the Second World War, degrading the quality of discernible intelligence to the point where the problems encountered converge with issues familiar to military photo reconnaissance analysts and restorers of antique paintings. The need to reanalyze voice recordings over and over and over again to detect faint traces of intelligence in a dense fog of noise is virtually identical to some EVP research techniques. However, the Assigned to Listen book makes no mention of any wartime radio monitor ascribing a signal to any ghost. Assigned to Listen states that, quote, projection is the mechanism by which we read familiar shapes into clouds or melodies into the monotonous rattle of a train. In a similar way, we can read speech into a medley of noises. Leonardo da Vinci advised young painters to practice their imagination by looking at cracked walls and reading fantastic scenes into strange patches, end quote. An important lesson of the BBC monitors' wartime experience was that they should not be too dogmatic about, so to speak, saving a difficult interpretation, where you've sort of like spent ages listening to this thing, you're trying to work out what it says, you think you've got an idea, some other sounds come along that don't make sense in context of your guesswork, so you try and save your original guesswork, if you see what I'm trying to say. They should instead recognise the importance of admitting failure when necessary and of discarding an incorrect hypotheses, even if much effort had been invested in their formation. If a monitor thought that he or she had finally made sense of a distorted voice, only to find its apparent meaning contradicted by sounds that followed, they should not try and force the square peg into the round hole out of sheer frustration. They should instead relax, staying true to the axiom that tiny bursts of information are inherently much easier to misinterpret than large ones. This is a very interesting point. And trust that their inability to interpret a larger sense showed that their initial guess had in fact always been wrong. This is a more general point about the context in which small pieces of information sit, the sort of corroborative context in which small pieces of information sit. Quote, the whole comes before the part. So they should instead formulate a new hypothesis and test that until it too was either discarded or proven. This is essentially classic Karl Popper philosophy of science about the formation and testing of hypotheses in scientific experiments. These experiences tend to support a statement by Michael Handel, who's a historian of military intelligence and deception techniques, that, quote, another piece of advice based on psychological tests is not to put too much confidence in conclusions drawn from a very small body of consistent data, because conclusions drawn from very small samples are highly unreliable. Stuff like the controversy about weapons of mass destruction during the Iraq War and things like that would be things that would, these kind of ideas could shed some light on that. So, in this case, the Assigned to Listen book states that 6 or 10 syllables may answer to all sorts of different types of projections, but 30 or 40 syllables are much less likely to trick you. Typical EVP recordings often involve no more than 3 or 4 syllables. Right. In 1996, in a Scientific American article by Sean Carlson, described an experiment by Diana Deutsch. Excuse me, just to make sure I haven't missed a bit. By Diana Deutsch, who's professor of psychoacoustics at University of California, San Diego, who in fact peer-reviewed my article subsequently. Diana Deutsch's experiment demonstrates how acoustic projections can be explored in controlled conditions. I'll play you in a second. Diana Deutsch recorded a person speaking two neutral words and created a sequence in which voice samples are reproduced in alternating stereo channels. Played back fast enough that the sounds remain recognizable as being human voices, but scrambling their semantic content. The sequence produces, quote, a pattern that sounds like language, but the words are not quite recognizable. Sean Carlson continued, within a few seconds of listening to this strange cacophony, my brain started imposing a shifting order over the chaos as I began hearing distinct words and phrases. First came blank, 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 then time, 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 then no time, long pine, and any time. I was then astonished to hear a man's voice spilling out of the right-hand speaker only. In a distinct Australian accent, it said, take me, take me, take me. And it's at this point that the ink blot test developed by the Swiss psychiatrist Hermann Rorschach springs to mind. And it's interesting to see that the three sample ink blot interpretations described in a standard university textbook by psychologist Henry Gleitman are, quote, a head blowing smoke, but also a ghost and an angel. So, this is a standard psychology textbook, course book. Two randomly chosen Rorschach ink blot tests describe a ghost, quote, a ghost and an angel, which is the last two being projections which strongly resemble the emotional agenda with EVP. So, I should perhaps kind of just clarify, just in case there's any confusion about this. The Rorschach ink blot test is where you get a piece of paper, splatter some ink on it, fold it in two so that you get a symmetrical print with the ink inside the folded paper, open it up again, and then ask test subjects to just, kind of describe the imaginary forms that they perceive in this imagery. And, the inference being that the process by which those kind of perceptions are produced, it has a lot in common with these kind of psychoacoustic mechanisms. Right, so Diana Deutsch.
The picket fence effect with speed.
Oh, nobody heard anything. Yeah. Corridor. That's the first time I've heard that. Yeah.
I heard pagan paycheck.
Yeah. 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 Say again?
Tiger.
Yeah. Yeah.
Tiger token taken.
Yeah.
I heard come play and then in pain.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, this is all sort of like free psychoanalysis you're receiving here. You know. Yeah. You know, there is, you know, some kind of circumstantial evidence of a sort of relationship between what people hear and sort of internal mental states, but it's pretty unreliable, to be honest. So, you know, people have experimented with using this as a kind of diagnostic test in the past and psychodiagnostic test, and it's never really worked. But nonetheless, the psychoacoustic phenomena that it's illustrating is very interesting. What you get with this recording are essentially three kind of things. I mean, it works for most people, probably about 95% of people it works. It would work a lot better if you listen to it for a long time, right? So, you know, what you probably get listening to that is this kind of vague sense that it resembles recognizable words. If you listen to it for long enough, you get this thing, or you may have an experience where it doesn't just kind of sound like it vaguely resembles some words, it actually sounds like somebody's whispering in your ear. And that's quite disconcerting when it happens. You have to listen to it for a long time for that to happen. Obviously, it's going to work better if you're somewhat under the influence. You know, there are various kind of environmental factors that may come into play. There are three levels of illusion, right? The first one, which everybody gets, is this sense that it's sort of vaguely drifting around all over the place, right? The second one, which is sort of like a higher level of illusion, is that it starts to vaguely resemble recognizable words, all right? Almost everybody gets those two. The third one, which you're maybe a little bit less likely to get, is the sense that somebody's actually just whispered a word in your ear. It's unlikely that you'll get that after listening to it for 2 minutes. But the thing to remember is that all three of those experiences are illusions, not just the third one. Yeah. Because, you know, the original recorded material is completely robotic, so even the sense of just kind of drifting like that is you know, what you're experiencing is your mind looking for information within that signal to try and attach a meaning to, and trying to find kind of melodic patterns within the, or lock onto melodic patterns within the spectrum of different sounds. It's consistent with a theory of so-called auditory scene analysis that was developed by the psychologist Albert Bregman. So, in contrast to the flexible and diverse projections that are produced by listening to Diana Deutsch's recording, which you just heard, you know, everybody hears something different. The preemptive narration that's typical of EVP demonstration recordings, like, as you heard at the beginning of this talk, tells listeners in advance how to interpret those recordings, creating a false sense that the meaning comes from outside individual listeners' imagination, and therefore an illusion of a shared experience and of objectivity. It's one of the sort of tricks that EVP demonstrations use to try and convince people that what they're doing is science. It's because everybody heard the same thing, right? In fact, the reason they heard the same thing is because they were told to hear it in advance, right? As the Assigned to Listen book says, quote, projections have a way of sticking to a sound. In terms of the physical mechanism that actually produces EVP recordings, signals from across the entire radio spectrum share a tendency to drift away from their original broadcast frequencies and to demodulate onto amplifying circuits, as all amplifiers within radios can function as broadband, very low frequency receivers. Microphone cables can function as VLF antennas, especially when unshielded and used outdoors. Taxis, police and ambulance, air traffic control, maritime, military, short, medium and long wave commercial broadcasts, TV voice channels, radio ham experiments, CB radio, bugging devices, conferencing systems, intercoms, baby alarms and analog mobile phones all share a tendency to emerge in the same VLF waveband, frequently producing stray signals. Stray signals are well known to concert PA operators, people who install in-car entertainment, and wildlife recording engineers who employ an arsenal of electromagnetic shielding devices to eliminate this interference. But when stray signals are heard, they're often very distorted and garbled, and therefore ideal raw material for acoustic projection. Some EVP researchers have attempted to exclude interference using metal Faraday cages, which surround the experimental apparatus. You know, it's a bit like putting the radio inside a kind of bird cage. Draining the and then earthing it, draining the external electromagnetic field into the ground. However, most EVP research techniques require not the removal, if you actually read EVP literature, but the addition of extra noise to the basic input in order to improve the success and clarity of EVP recordings. Again, this is a very psychologically very interesting point. Radiostatic, deliberately mistuned voice transmissions, especially in languages not understood by the researchers, audio oscillators, microphone feedback and tape recordings of foreign language courses, birdsong, fountains, hissing taps, rain, surf and wind are all used by EVP researchers. Deliberately adding noise to improve EVP reception may seem counterintuitive, but there is another experiment I'll play you, which demonstrates both the strength of the preemptive prompting that I talked about and of the importance of adding background noise. The psychologist David Bruce, quote, recorded a set of ordinary sentences and played them in the presence of noise so intense that the voice was just audible but not intelligible. He told his listeners that these were sentences on some general topic such as sports, and then asked them to repeat back to him what they just heard. He then told them that they would hear more sentences on a different topic, which they were also asked to repeat back. This was done several times. Each time the listeners repeated sentences appropriate to the topic they'd been told about in advance. When at the end of the experiment David Bruce told them that they'd heard exactly the same recording every time, all he changed was the announcement, most listeners were unable to believe it. Similarly, the psychologist Albert Bregman prepared a demonstration which again shows how adding noise, in this case however to interrupted speech recordings, can help the mind to fill in missing information. So it's adding noise to help the mind fill in missing information. So you conventionally think of noise as something that makes a signal harder to interpret, not as something that makes a signal easier to interpret. In the following recording, alternating 1/6 and 1/4 second long sections in a speech recording are replaced by silences. This is in fact a stand-up comedy routine called the broken microphone routine. I forget the comedian's name, and it's sort of like, Charlie, can you get, because the machine's not, the amp's broken or the cable on the microphone's bust, excuse me, I've lost my place. Alternating 1/6, then 1/4 long second sections in a speech recording are replaced by silences, with the effect that the sentence is made unintelligible. When these silences are replaced with white noise bursts, however, most listeners report hearing a continuous stream of speech, with the continuous speech appearing to continue underneath and through the noise bursts and to run throughout the recording. That continuous stream is, however, an audio illusion. The effect is sometimes known as phonemic restoration. And this is probably the least subjective of all of the illusions that I'm going to demonstrate today. This is more the most kind of hardwired and most mechanically reliable, if you see what I mean, in terms of the perception that people have of it.
We play a sentence in which half of the sound has been eliminated by taking out every other 1/6 second segment and replacing it with a silence. Then the same sentence is played with loud noise bursts, replacing the silences. Does this make the speech sound more complete? Finally, you will hear the intact sentence.
Auditory scene analysis involves grouping of sounds. The principle of similarity is very important. Auditory scene analysis involves the grouping of sounds. The principle of similarity is very important. Auditory scene analysis involves the grouping of sounds. The principle of similarity is very important. Auditory scene analysis involves the grouping of sounds. The principle of similarity is very important.
Again, half the speech is deleted, but this time every other 1/4 second segment has been deleted. Again, judge the apparent completeness of the sentence.
Auditory scene analysis involves grouping of sounds. The principle of similarity is very important. Auditory scene analysis involves grouping of sounds. The principle of similarity is very important. Auditory scene analysis involves grouping of sounds. The principle of similarity is very important. Auditory scene analysis involves grouping of sounds. The principle of similarity is very important.
Yeah. I mean, one of the interesting things about that is that you would think that the smaller gaps would be easier for the mind to kind of compensate and sort of, fill in the blanks, but actually the longer gaps with the longer noise bursts give a more complete auditory illusion. So, sort of related to this, the psychologist Philip Rubin developed a technique known as sine wave speech, which involves creating computer-synthesized simulations of the major energy bands or formats in real speech recordings. As you'll hear on first hearing, let's just cue it up. Yeah, no. Okay. As you'll hear on first hearing, the meaning of sine wave speech is usually hard to discern. After, however, you've heard the natural voice recordings from which the sine wave speech sounds were made in the first place, and then hear the sine wave speech again, more accurate perceptions suddenly jump out, sometimes quite vivid, from what were previously quite unintelligible sound patterns. This effect shows how EVP demonstrations use prompting to convince listeners that the interpretation projected by the original EVP researcher is shared, thereby creating the illusion that EVP recordings are objective evidence. When you hear the original, first of all you hear the so-called sine wave speech, then you hear the natural speech recording from which that was created, and that natural speech recording, once you've been prompted by that natural speech recording, your interpretation, when you hear the sine wave speech again, your interpretation of the sine wave speech is dramatically different.
She ironed her skirt.
The police returned to the museum.
The floor was quite slippery.
Oh, hang on. Oh, crap, sorry. Okay. How much have I messed that up? A typical EVP process involves prompting the imagination by asking questions of the alleged ghosts out loud in the style of a spiritualist seance, recording and then repeatedly analysing any signals that emerge, often over and over and again for many hours. Researchers alleged the presence of polyglot voices, which you heard in the original Radivay stuff, which allegedly switch languages from one word to the next in the same sentence. And EVP enthusiasts evidently scour foreign dictionaries for meanings that match the rhythms of recorded sequences. EVP researchers maintain that ghosts invent neologisms and take liberties with grammar, so we're asked to accept that entities which have acquired the intellect to speak many different languages have lost the ability to speak grammatically or to use proper words. These interpretive techniques set the widest possible parameters for the subjective attribution of meaning, and, as before, by asking questions of the spirit world out loud, researchers tell themselves and other listeners how to interpret the sounds before the signals manifest, heavily influencing subsequent analysis. In his book Treatise on Physiological Optics of 1866, the psychologist Hermann Helmholtz described human perceptions as unconscious inductive inferences which, despite heavy reliance on memory as well as on direct sensation, quote, come about with immutable certainty at lightning speed and without the slightest meditation. Helmholtz's theory of what he called perceptual hypotheses suggests, in plain language, that much of what we experience as normal reality is in fact a form of intelligent guesswork. So, with hearing as with vision, and particularly when speech is distorted, obscured or interrupted by noise, the mind makes use of creative and extremely well-informed guesswork. The paradox is that it is in part that guesswork that we experience as being reality, and you can demonstrate very, very similar faculties in all other sensory modalities, vision, taste, sense of temperature, things like that. The notion of so-called perceptual hypothesis is an extremely robust model for explaining many aspects of human perception. Normally, this guesswork generates perceptions which agree with a whole spectrum of different inputs from vision, from taste, from touch, from smell, and from memory. So although it's guesswork that's informed by a vast kind of spectrum of sort of self-corroborating and mutually supportive information. Normally that guesswork creates images which provide accurate representations of reality. So there's the paradox. It's guesswork, but it's also, usually right. Yeah, the guesswork is usually accurate. So we are therefore only aware of the process of projection, the imaginary aspect of this and creative aspect of this process, and especially its imaginary and subjective aspect, when it very occasionally generates perceptions which disagree with that broader context. And really in the sort of realm of sound, that's mostly only going to happen when after the invention of recording technology. The only sort of context in which people can kind of separate the experience of sound out from its original source to the extent that they can produce these kind of misperceptions or become aware of these kind of misperceptions very clearly. Let me say that again. So we are therefore only aware of the process of projection, and especially its imaginary and subjective aspect, when it very occasionally generates perceptions which disagree with that broad context, and it's those rare mistakes only that we consciously categorize as being illusions. So psychological projection is discussed in some detail in the art theorist and historian Ernst Gombrich's classic book Art and Illusion. Unfortunately, I don't have a copy with me. Ernst Gombrich cites the artist Leonardo da Vinci's advice to painters, which is particularly interesting because of its final sentence. Quoting Leonardo here, "You should look at certain walls stained with damp, or at stones of uneven colour. If you have to invent a background for a painting, you will be able to see in these the likenesses of divine landscapes adorned with mountains, ruins, rocks, woods, plains, hills and valleys in great variety. And then again you'll be able to see their battles and strange figures in violent action, expressions of faces and clothes, and an infinity of things that you will be able to reduce to their proper and complete forms." And this is also from Leonardo's description. In such walls, the same thing happens as in the sound of church bells, in whose stroke you might find every named word you can imagine. In London we have a traditional Cockney folk poem which says, "Oranges and lemons, say the bells of St Clement's. When will you pay me, say the bells at Old Bailey. When I grow rich, say the bells at Fleet Ditch." The illusion that Leonardo da Vinci described is related to those that you have experienced during this presentation, and it was in fact Ernst Gombrich, the author of Art and Illusion, who, during World War II, was the monitoring supervisor in the BBC monitoring service, and it was Ernst Gombrich who wrote all of the material previously quoted in this talk about acoustic projection, which appears in the book Assigned to Listen. The authors of Assigned to Listen themselves quoted the material from Gombrich from an internal BBC memorandum that he wrote called Some Axioms, Musings and Hints on Hearing. In that memorandum, Gombrich summarised his ideas as being the story of an, I think this comes from the Napoleonic War, this story, the story of an army signaller who, quote, misheard the urgent message, "Send reinforcements and going to advance," as "Send 3 and 4pence and going to a dance." So, In highlighting this connection, the Rorschach audio book emphasises the role that relatively little known wartime intelligence work with sound had on what is arguably one of the most important works of visual arts theory ever published. And Gombrich does talk about this connection in Art and Illusion. He does talk about his experience with the BBC during the war. And what's most surprising is while the influence that Leonardo da Vinci's advice on figurative and abstract painting is probably inestimable, everybody, not even in sort of like the art college system, but I think in popular culture is probably sort of familiar with a version of the Leonardo quote. So it's kind of pretty much absorbed in popular culture as well as within sort of fine arts practice. From the point of view of contemporary fine arts practice, Leonardo da Vinci's final sentence about sound of church bells seems to have been almost totally ignored. Incidentally, according to Wikipedia, and to an interview with the filmmaker Oliver Postgate, conducted by Clive Banks, no relation, the voices used in the children's TV show The Clangers were created using Swanee whistles, which are like these kind of like recorders with a piston in them. Go like that, right? Or piston flutes played, much like sine wave speech, in a way that, quote, followed the rhythm and intonation of a script in the English language. So the sound effects of the clangers were produced using a very simple analog version of this, basically the same technique that's used to make sine wave speech recordings. It's also consistent with Rorschach audio type phenomena that, quote, when the Clangers TV series was shown without narration to a group of... The BBC ran some tests to see whether or not people could understand the English script that was being reproduced using this technique. When the series was shown without narration to a group of overseas students, many of them felt that the Clangers were speaking their own particular language, and that a, quote, non-worded but musically scored script seemed to allow the Clangers to say almost anything, including predictably swear words. At the beginning of the third episode, a door to the Clangers cave system fails to open. Major Clanger says, "Oh sod it, the bloody thing's stuck again," and kicks the door, with the words being sufficiently well articulated that apparently the BBC asked Oliver Postgate to have the sounds removed. Okay, so I mean you can actually look that up, and if you watch the video on YouTube, and it does work. It's another. If you say the Diana Deutsch recording is a really good example of an artist beating scientists at their own game in terms of producing a really classic piece of contemporary art. Many of the phenomena that were sort of, so to speak, discovered by psychoacousticians have also been discovered by popular culture. The instance with the Clangers being one example. As demonstrated by sine wave speech, if we know what an ambiguous speech recording is meant to say, as long as the meaning attributed to that recording is reasonably plausible, it's more likely that we'll interpret ambiguous material in a way that appears to corroborate the opinion of the person who told us what to expect in the first place. So, in context of considering EVP, I'll just wind up the talk here, it's relevant to directly quote E.H. Gombrich as follows. E.H. Gombrich, author of Art and Illusion. It so happens that I had an opportunity to study this aspect of perception in a severely practical context during the war. I was employed for 6 years by the British Broadcasting Corporation in their monitoring service, where we kept constant watch on radio transmissions from friend and foe. Incidentally, my grandfather also worked for the BBC monitoring service. It was in this context that the importance of guided projection in our understanding of symbolic material was brought home to me. Some of the transmissions which interested us were barely audible, and it became quite an art, even a sport, to interpret the few whiffs of speech sound that were all we really had on the wax cylinders onto which these broadcasts had been recorded. It was then we learned to what extent our knowledge and our expectations influence our hearing. You had to know what might be said in order to hear what was said. More importantly, you selected from your knowledge of possibilities certain word combinations and tried projecting them into the noises heard. The problem was a twofold one: to think of possibilities and to retain one's critical faculty. So in other words, you have to kind of dream up hypotheses that might be slightly fantastical, but also you need to discard incorrect hypotheses if they don't fit the broader context of information. So you need to be both creative and extremely critical. And I guess that's in microcosm the kind of issue that I have with the embracing of EVP by the art world, is that people are interested in the creative aspect of it, but they're not interested in the critical aspect. To some extent, that's also could be used as a broader analogy to do with more general problems to do with the art world. So the problem was a twofold one: to think of possibilities and to retain one's critical faculty. Anyone whose imagination ran away with them, right? Hold that thought for a second. Anyone whose imagination ran away with them, who could hear any words, as Leonardo could in The Sound of Church Bells, couldn't play the game. This was useless. You had to keep your projection flexible to remain willing to try out fresh alternatives and to admit the possibility of defeat. For this was the most striking experience of all. Once your expectation was firmly set and your conviction settled, you ceased to be aware of your own activity as part of this process. The noises appeared to fall into place and to be transformed into the expected words by the process of expectation itself, right? So strong was this effect of suggestion that we made it a practice never to tell a colleague our own interpretation if we wanted him to test it out. In other words, if you wanted a second opinion about what you thought a recording said, you would never make a suggestion to the person from whom you were seeking a second opinion about what you thought that recording actually said. Okay, so thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Joe. We've got loads of time for questions. Does anyone want to get us started? And people online in the chat, you're also welcome to. Someone commented after the Diana Deutsch exercise, point blank, tada, haha. I'm not sure if the haha was part of the
I'm surprised it works online, to be
not.
honest, because I'm really not sure why, but it doesn't really work in mono, only really works in stereo. I guess the kind of level of confusion, there's a sort of minimum level of threshold or minimum level of confusion that needs to pass a certain kind of threshold before you can start to kind of project your own words into that recording. It doesn't really work online. So, if you sort of put the lecture online, that aspect of it's not likely to be a smash hit, to be honest. And it doesn't work in mono. So it's quite interesting that somebody watching online actually got something meaningful out of that. Yeah, it must be good sound quality. Yeah.
I had a question.
Yeah.
Just thinking, maybe
Where are you?
I'm here.
Oh yeah.
Maybe slight, because obviously your talk's more focused on the kind of audio phenomena, but thinking of EVP as a cultural phenomena.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I was wondering how, in the kind of contemporary world, so both maybe thinking about, obviously when it was starting, working with analog technology, now in the world digital recording technology, which obviously functions very differently, but then also modern methods of information sharing, how I was wondering if there's some cultures around the world where EVP has really embedded, and in some cultures where it's almost bounced off, and what this can kind of tell us about EVP and its cultural relativity, I guess.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. There's a whole field of social anthropology that kind of revolves around, I forget the buzzword, unfortunately, but it kind of revolves around whether or not people from different cultures perceive illusions differently. So I've got a book about this, and it talks, for instance, about Sasquatch beliefs in Bigfoot arising from auditory illusions that are interpreted in the belief system of Native American people who live in California, for instance. So they hear sounds in the forest, and they're interpreted according to a certain kind of set of sort of cultural preconditions. I'm not massively up on this field, but there is this whole literature about whether or not people perceive different optical illusions mainly differently in different cultures. It's quite controversial, but EVP would be a really good example of whereby people who approach this kind of subject matter, the material of EVP with what you might call a scientific mindset, tend to interpret it one way, and people who approach the same material with a religious fundamentalist mindset. Not all, some religious fundamentalist people or just religious people, non-fundamentalist, are actually bitterly opposed to this kind of stuff, just to put it in context. But anyway, for the sake of argument, some people who have a strong religious beliefs or beliefs about the afterlife, or more often have been recently bereaved, will interpret exactly the same information in a completely different way. So I think EVP is actually a particularly vivid illustration of that sort of cultural relativity argument. I think I'm not getting the terminology exactly right, but yeah. So, you know, I mean, culture can make a huge difference to how people interpret stuff like this. And they're not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily apply to the fine detail, you know, the exact meaning that specific sounds might appear to be making, but more to just like the sort of global interpretation of what something actually represents, you know, in a kind of factual way, you know. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi there.
Yeah. Hi.
In the Diana Deutsch recording, you mentioned that stereo is a contributor to the sort of
seems to be, yeah.
that people get. Are there any other components? Like, is there something about the loop duration or the type of content? Like, what are the things that, if you wanted to maybe recreate it, what would you be looking for?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people have said, you know, when I've given these talks in the past, we should remix this stuff, or, you know, lots of people have done their own versions of stuff like that. Other sound artists have done their own versions of stuff like this. I'm generally not keen on the idea of remixing it, because the idea is that it's your mind that does the remixing, right? You know, so the less you interfere with the original source material, the better, from the point of view of actually demonstrating the power of the mind to influence your perceptions. And likewise, if you actually remix stuff, so kind of like add musical elements or sort of like durational changes to this kind of material, again, the thing that's important about the Diana Deutsch recording is that it's absolutely robotic and repetitive, and that all of the many changes that you perceive in that recording, from the drifting effect up to actual illusions of speech, all of those are actually, they're changes that are taking place inside your own mind, you know. So, you know, I did do a sort of comedy pastiche of the Diana Deutsch recording, which was some loops of, you know, there was this kind of Islamophobic conspiracy theory about the similarity between the words Obama and Osama. So I did a kind of not terribly successful kind of Diana Deutsch spoof based on that, which was published by a Sonic Arts organisation in Finland. And there's another one which I tried to do, but it didn't really work, which was a sort of loop of a Chicago house producer going, fuck me, fuck me, fuck me, fuck me, fuck me, you know, a bit like the take me loop, but literalizing that kind of metaphor again. It wasn't a massively successful joke, you know, but I do my best, you know. But I think just kind of like rehashing things that Diana Deutsch has already done better is probably a bit of a waste of time, you know. Yeah.
Yes, so sticking with the Diana Deutsch example, I'm kind of curious how much it being in stereo in a room improves the illusion over wearing headphones, because when you wear headphones, you don't perceive that, like, the effects of the room aren't imprinted on the words.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever tried it with headphones. Interesting you should mention that. So my guess would be it probably wouldn't work very well. I don't really know. You know, but one thing you do get, if you play the Diana Deutsch recording over and over again, and you have the freedom to move around the space, you do get dramatically different effects depending on where you are in the room. You know, because all the different frequencies in the recording are going to influence the kind of acoustic space in different ways, and then those, for instance, reflections and reverberations at different frequencies are going to be coming back in you know, forming different complex patterns that overlap with each other and interact with each other. So you get a very complex, sort of vivid sort of bunch of psychoacoustic cues that your brain's trying to make sense of in a situation like that. You know.
There is a question on the chat from Daniel Freeman.
Yeah.
Are you aware of sound artists or musicians who are purposefully and consciously using acoustic projection to extrapolate and extend their work further than they would without it?
Yeah. Barbara Ellison is one who's made a double CD set based on these ideas. Frankly, I think she's, sorry to say this, but I think she's completely missing the point. The whole thing about the, goes back to what I just said about, if you want to illustrate the power, the influence that the mind itself is having on these kind of perceptions, intervening in a kind of artistic way into this material or adding to it is completely missing the point of it's the mind of the listener that's being the creative artist, if you see what I mean, when somebody's actually interacting with a recording like this. It's illustrating the extent to which perception itself has a creative aspect, is a creative faculty. There's some very interesting ideas about that. So I think, this is a context in which it's fruitful for an artist to actually step back and do as little as possible, not to actually add significant or try and add stuff that actually kind of muddies the water when it comes to things like this. Having said that, there are some very interesting creative uses of these kind of phenomena, but almost all of them are basically stand-up comedy routines. So, in the past I've actually given a talk which is based on the stand-up comedy routines. So I've got a whole DVD of kind of 6 or 7 different clips of things like the broken microphone routine and Deaf in the Trenches by the Two Ronnies and stuff like that, the Four Candles sketch, Fork Handles by Two Ronnies, where a bloke goes into a hardware shop and asks for 4 candles, all this kind of stuff. So, those would be examples of where, I think they're sort of really more artistically interesting than trying to turn stuff like this into ambient music,
Thank you. Any other questions?
No.
I mean, maybe leading on for that, if the Rorschach audio project is creating greater awareness around auditory illusions and, I guess, psychological projection onto our hearing, another phenomenon, what do you hope are the implications for sound arts in a wider sense, or what do you think your project helps to provoke?
The idea of Rorschach audio is a pretty powerful kind of global sort of concept in terms of explaining how people can kind of project whatever they want into music to some extent. There's a very strong aspect of what you might call projective identification in kind of conventional rock music. People record essentially completely meaningless sounds and project a whole kind of different spectrum of characteristics into it that are manifest through the world of experimental underground music and stuff like that. And I think this an understanding of how the mind can process sound is quite helpful to sort of unpick how that kind of creativity has kind of traction in terms of the way people relate to sound. But really, it's up to kind of people to kind of run with it and do whatever they want. I mean, primarily, this particular project was conceived out of my frustration with people falling for sort of frankly crap from EVP researchers. It struck me as being a statement of the obvious that these are not recordings of supernatural phenomena. However, when I tried to explain to people why I thought it was obvious they weren't supernatural phenomena, it became apparent that there were actually some pretty interesting psychological processes involved. It started off when I read the Scientific American article by Sean Carlson about Diana Deutsch, and then, with time I became aware of many more sort of related experiments like the Albert Bregman material and the picket fence effect and sine wave speech and stuff like that, which all basically corroborate the same kind of model of perception, this kind of notion of perceptual hypotheses and intelligent guesswork in perception. So, this has ramifications for sonic art, for art in general, but it also has a lot to do with parapsychology and just sort of general education about scientific methodology, the relevance of scientific methodology to contemporary arts practice, which is frankly an unfashionable subject, to relatively sort of what people now erroneously regard as, well, mainstream and erroneously regard as being sort of conservative models of philosophy of science. In fact, if you rewind to the 1930s and previously, the kind of mainstream, what are now regarded as being mainstream ideas about philosophy of science were regarded as pretty radical, in an era when science was much less institutionalized and was much more overtly political, but there's a whole kind of cultural debate about that. It's maybe a bit too complicated to go into here, but there's so some of it's relevant to sonic art, some of it's just about general education, and to make people, to raise people's kind of critical threshold a little bit, encourage people to be more skeptical about the kind of claims that some people make about material like this.
Harrietta says in response to that, and Sun, the band Sun with the brackets, Sun O with the brackets, perhaps with their walls of sound creating auditory hallucinations.
Yeah, I mean, technically they're probably not creating auditory hallucinations. A hallucination is, it depends how you define it a bit, but somebody once said to me, if you mishear something, that's an illusion. If Jesus comes into the room and shakes you by the hand, that's a hallucination. So when people sort of misperceive something in context of like very intense sound performance or something like that, or they have kind of unusual mental experiences, which does happen, it's probably not a hallucination in the strict sense of the word. But that is something that a lot of people, particularly in kind of sort of heavy noise music and stuff like that, have been interested in for kind of 30 or 40 years, I guess. So yes, I guess some do that kind of stuff. They're definitely not the first. People like SBK and Nocturnal Emissions and groups like that, Throbbing Gristle, were very interested in some of these kind of ideas. With varying degrees, at varying sort of ideological positions that were attached to their interpretation of that kind of subject matter, from the sort of highly skeptical to the sort of credulous, sort of occult type ideas, but roughly speaking, dealing with the same kind of experiences.
Thank you.
Are you aware of any artists that are engaging actively with both like auditory illusions and visual illusions in like a simultaneous way?
I'm glad you asked that. Cause
okay,
yes,
yeah.
I mean, that's a big aspect of the other stuff that I do is, I've tried to create some what's the remote gone? Oh, hang on. That was the clip that I nearly played by accident earlier on. I can get it to work. Take a while for the no. Oh, anyway, Blu-ray. Oh, okay. It needs to kind of wake up again. But there's a, sometimes if there's time in a talk like this, I play a little clip of an exhibit I do called The Analysis of Beauty, which is relevant because. Hang on. I think the Blu-ray player's gone to sleep. Yeah. Yeah, okay. So what you get with it, what you have with this exhibit, which is weirdly, Justin is attached to the Sonic Research Group, is that right? Yeah, at London South Bank University over the road. This exhibit was created when a friend of mine was studying closely, hang on, let me. If you watch that pattern for a little while, at first it seems completely flat, right? Then it seems to be forming into an object, right? I'll play it again in a second, but it's easier to explain it when it's not playing. It sort of seems to be forming into an object. Sometimes that object seems to be quite strongly coherent as a sort of three-dimensional object. Sometimes it kind of wanders off and sort of dissolves into other things. Sometimes the object appears to be rotating to the left. Sometimes it appears to be rotating to the right. Yeah. Sometimes the direction in which it appears to be rotating changes. If you blink, it'll change direction. If you tilt your head from left to right, it can change direction. Or if you think about it in a different way, it can change direction. And so it may take a few moments for that effect to build up in your mind, but it's pretty reliable. It does work with most people. And as with, say, the Diana Deutsch stuff, all of those changes, none of those changes are taking place on the screen. They're all taking place inside your own mind, and it's a very vivid example of the formation of so-called perceptual hypotheses. So your mind is using guesswork to try and interpret ambiguous information, but the information is so ambiguous that it can't kind of can't make a decision about which particular interpretation it wants to lock onto. Yeah, and this is quite strongly illustrated by this example. Even though the video is pretty poor quality, it would work a lot better with a better quality video. And there are a couple of other exhibits that I do that kind of more or less kind of relate to similar ideas. But anyway, see how you get on with that. The soundtrack is actually the sound that produced the pattern on the screen also, but it's not the most interesting aspect of this particular exhibit. Any luck? When I first got the lab oscillators back home, I was mixing them through a DJ kind of mixing desk type thing, which you wouldn't normally do with lab oscillators, but that was kind of fun. Then feeding it into this oscilloscope, and I was just looking at this thing, and suddenly I kind of hit on this strange pattern, sort of had this hypnotic feature. It's much more vivid when you see it on a small screen. I just watched it for hours and hours and hours and hours, and at the time I didn't have the language to explain it. It took about 2 years to kind of really get my head around what was going on, and it's quite well known in experimental psychology. It's an illusion that's known as the kinetic depth effect. There's a very interesting literature on that. I honestly think this is the best illustration of the kinetic depth effect that I've ever seen. So there are a whole bunch of other demonstrations of the same thing. There's one that probably you might have seen online, which is the rotating dancer illusion. A lot of people have seen that. But the thing about this one that's better than the rotating dancer is that here you visual depth. You perceive visual depth because I think there are 4 major cues that determine perception of visual depth. One is binocular vision, right? Actually doesn't make that much difference to depth perception, but nonetheless, that's the basis of 3D movies and stuff like that. So you have binocular vision. You have object precedence, which is a close object may physically obscure an object that's further away. You have geometric perspective, where objects get smaller and recede towards a vanishing point in the distance. But you also have aerial perspective, where haze, basically water vapor, builds up in the atmosphere, so that objects in the far distance are more faint and diffuse, and tend towards a kind of blue mist and stuff like that, which again very relevant to kind of Leonardo da Vinci and stuff. You have object precedence, motion parallax. You learn to interpret the objective information about the actual measurements of physical space that your brain can infer from the relative behaviour of objects as they move appear to move in three-dimensional space when you're looking at them. So you have object precedence, geometric perspective, aerial perspective. What was the other one I just said? Anyway, four major sources of information that determine visual depth perception, and absolutely none of them are present in this demonstration, whereas with the spinning dancer, it does have some depth information in the sense that when the dancer spins, it gets narrower, and that's a very powerful source of depth information. So here you have illusions of depth emerging despite the absence of all of the information conventionally thought to enable perception of visual space, and the only thing really that's enabling you to see this pattern as being an object is the guesswork that your mind is projecting into the video.
It's really cool.
Thank you.
Do you know about the sculpture Dream Machine by Brian Geisen?
Yes. Yes,
Yeah.
I do, yeah. Have you ever tried it?
Yeah, I've tried it.
Yeah.
I didn't really get anything from it, but
yeah.
I wonder if something like that could be paired with an auditory illusion as well.
Potentially, yes. I mean, Brian Geisen's sidekick, William Burroughs, experimented a lot with tape recorders, particularly when he lived in London in the 1960s, under the influence of a friend of his called Ian Somerville, who kind of introduced him to experimenting with tape recorders. And basically he did the same kind of stuff as Diana Deutsch, but in a much less disciplined kind of way. So he was kind of messing around with tape loops and stuff like that. And when Radiveh started attracting publicity with his book Breakthrough in 1970, William Burroughs rushed to publish an article for Crawdaddy magazine, which was like a kind of hippie rock magazine in the 70s, saying, I discovered all this kind of stuff first, and he was kind of right, actually. I've kind of, I had to go at the Dream Machine donkeys years ago, it's like a thing that young people did at the time, and for me it didn't really work, but I think other people, maybe it works for them. There was a Dream Machine based exhibit in Woolwich a few years ago, which I didn't see because I've got a neurological problem to do with my eyesight, so I didn't want to risk having an episode looking at this exhibit, but apparently it worked really well. So they'd really, as described to me by somebody who saw it, they kind of cracked the formula of how to get the Dream Machine to really work. For anybody, what's your name? Sorry.
Saya.
Yeah, what Saya's describing, if anybody's not familiar with this, is that Brian Geisen, who was kind of an interesting artist. The most interesting thing about him is not really his art, but the fact that he was actually a cryptographer during the Second World War. He devised, in collaboration with William Burroughs, this machine, which is basically a cardboard tube about this big. You plonk it on the turntable of a record player, cut holes in it with geometric patterns, lower a light bulb on a cable into the middle of it, and then stare at it, and it produces kind of pseudo-hallucinatory type experiences. But my experience has been, and I think maybe yours too, is that they're much less vivid than they're kind of hyped up to be by these guys who thought that this was frankly they were hoping to market it as a kind of commercial product that they thought would make a lot of money because it would be, quote, free drugs for the world, in the era of kind of psychedelic drugs, and it didn't really kind of work. But it's definitely related to these kinds of phenomena. But paradoxically, as you mentioned it, William Burroughs' experiments with sound are actually much closer to these kind of things than the Dream Machine itself.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. We done?
Anyone else?
Yeah.
Just coming back to what I was kind of asking before around the relevance of this work.
Yeah.
in sound art. I was thinking as you were presenting, if this was like a visual arts context and you were here giving a kind of presentation around optical illusions, it's just, it kind of throws into like kind of the disparity somehow, and something, what's the question, like, do you agree that there's a kind of suggestibility attached to auditory perception that you're trying to create awareness of?
Yeah, it's the entire basis of auditory perception, in fact. The reason that might sound a little bit far-fetched is because, you know, from the moment we're born, we start honing and refining these faculties to an incredibly high degree of sophistication. I think one of the reasons that the McGurk effect, it's no coincidence that McGurk effect is based around reading eyes, lips, and to some extent actually neck movements, and interpreting them in the relationship between that visual information and sounds like bar and gar and things like that, because those are the kind of sounds that babies articulate when they're very, very young, and the kind of visual experiences that babies have when they're looking at their parents' face. So, sorry, I'm losing my thread. Can you ask the question again?
I guess just why is it? What is it about auditory perception in particular that has this suggestibility that you're
I don't think there is anything particular about auditory. It's basically exactly the same with vision and with speech perception and, you know, some extent perception of other sounds. Is that excuse me, I'll get my thought process back. We've become very, very, very good at making these kind of guesses, and the guesses are based on this enormous spectrum of other corroborating evidence from all the other sense faculties that we have. So although we're guessing about the environment, the mind is constructing this partly illusory representation of the world that we're trying to navigate and find our way safely through the lecture theatre without tripping over and, you know, hurting ourselves or whatever. It's because we're really, really good at it. So it's almost impossible to sort of unlock or sort of detach yourself or step back from those kind of mental processes, dissociate from normal perception to the extent that's required to perceive the extent to which those perceptions are partly based on guesswork. So, you know, the sort of common sense view of perception is there's a bunch of stuff out there in the world around us, makes sounds or, you know, has kind of visual characteristics. We see these objects and we just know what they are. You know, we don't need to think about it. But in fact, you know, you built up your ability to decode these kind of experiences very slowly, you know, through childhood into adulthood, and have become incredibly good at it. So, you know, it might seem counterintuitive to suggest that you know, visual and auditory reality are to some extent an illusion, but the reason that you don't realize they're an illusion is because it's paradoxically an illusion that's almost always right, you know, to most practical intents and purposes. So there's a kind of weird paradox there. It's not quite the kind of Hare Krishna position that all reality is an illusion. There is an aspect of that. There are ways that you can detach, for instance, with certain kind of meditation techniques and things like that, to an extent that you become aware of the illusory nature of reality, but the paradox is that it's still real. It's still reality, you know. So these kind of processes underlie all forms of perception, you know, and another reason that the mind has to rely on these kind of perceptions is because of the sheer quantity of information that you're absorbing all the time from your auditory and visual environment is absolutely enormous, and you have to be able to kind of filter it down. If you sat and thought about every tiny little kind of pixel of light that you were presented with in your visual environment, you would never have time to be able to make sense of it. So, you know, a lot of what you perceive as being real is a kind of reconstructed set of memories, right? And in the case of sound, you can actually see that happening in the brain. So there are certain sounds which are processed by the mind as being environmental noise, and they're harder to decode and require more mental effort, right? And there are certain sounds that are perceived as being speech and music, right? Particularly speech, to a lesser extent music. And those sounds are easier to decode because the mind only needs a slight whiff, as it referred to in the text I read to you earlier, of what the meaning might be, and then it recovers the rest of it from memory, and that's very easy to demonstrate in speech experiments, like when people finish other people's sentences for them. You only need sometimes the beginning of the word in the right context to be able to guess 100% accurately what somebody's going to say next, and that's often similar to what that also has a parapsychology aspect to it, because when people finish other people's sentences for them, sometimes they think that's evidence of sort of extrasensory perception. It's not, right? It's just evidence of our very sophisticated understanding of language, and the kind of probabilistic aspect of language. So, it is actually pretty much the whole of human perception, but normally I wouldn't sort of emphasize that point because it does seem slightly counterintuitive when you sort of first come across a talk like this to suggest that the whole world is stuff like EVP, because obviously EVP is kind of pretty fringe, but in fact the notion of perceptual hypothesis is a very, very powerful way of explaining almost every aspect, some aspects of almost everything to do with human perception, even taste, illusions of taste and things like that, illusions of temperature.
Yeah, thank you. I agree. We have a question.
Hi, thank you so much. That's super interesting. I just wanted to ask, I guess, about visualization and kind of, because obviously, I mean, a lot of the stuff that you showed us was already kind of using our imagination in a big way, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the suggestibility of, let's say, if somebody says a phrase and then we hear it after, like when we kind of hear the sound again, right? That's kind of our that the suggestion is kind of embedded in our imagination and influences it. But I'm interested in using visualization, or more like kind of the imagined scape or the mindscape, to kind of create a basis for a sonic illusion, or for any kind of illusion at that point. But like, I guess, do you know? That's kind of the question. Do you know any examples of using like or kind of visualization and imagination, as in kind of like with eyes closed, kind of creating some kind of imagination, or maybe presenting suggestions of various kinds that then influence the perception?
I mean, that's an aspect that I go into in much more detail in the book. So if you're interested in that, try and get it from the library, which is the kind of analogues between this kind of stuff and actual arts practice. So if you go back to, it's not even really contemporary art practice, because classical landscape art in ancient China, going back to, I don't know, 3rd century BC or something like that, is basically a huge something, this technique that was discovered in maybe the 16th or 17th century in European art. It goes back in Chinese art to pretty much the beginning of time, of kind of like making random marks on a surface and then interpreting those as being landscapes or faces, stuff like that, mostly landscapes, I guess. So Chinese landscape art would be a really good example of that. There's a whole culture in Chinese aesthetics around what you call scholars' rocks, where you interpret kind of meaningful images in rock formations. That's a huge factor in a lot of animistic religions. So say like with Tibetan Bon Chos animism in Tibet, that's based on the premise that and there's similar things in Japan as well, that the kind of faces that you would see in rock formations and stuff like that are actually real, and that therefore the rock formations exhibit those faces because they do actually have a soul, which is might not be factually true, but it's a kind of like a sort of coherent proposition, if you see what I mean. It's not strictly logical, but if you don't have an understanding of the nature of mechanisms of visual perception, that's a pretty good hypothesis for actually explaining those the phenomenon whereby a face appears to be looking at you from a rock or from a tree or something like that. There are lots of historical examples of this. And in sort of fine arts practice, you get stuff like what's he called? I'm going to forget somebody's name, but anyway, let's skip forward to surrealism. It's basically about 90% of surrealism,
Yeah, that's basically it historically. But interestingly, I guess I'm interested in like how can we use the contemporary kind of symbolism of things, or the as you say, I mean, the objects that we identify in various different cultures differently, obviously, but largely there are certain I guess assumptions that we operate from, or certain like understanding of objects or symbols, right? So I guess I'm interested in like using those collective understandings, or I mean, they might be not so collective, it might be quite individual in many cases, but I guess like using those meanings and those notions to then juxtapose them or create a sense of I don't know, a new space, a new perceptions.
I don't think you can. The thing is, I don't think you can really, or it's very difficult to predict where these interesting examples of these kind of things might come from, and particularly ones that might be, politically pertinent, either in terms of kind of real world politics or in terms of the kind of politics of the art world. Something that's going to kind of create an impact in the art world. You can't really. Very hard to say in advance what specific imagery might produce an artistically interesting effect. I think the idea, one thing that I've experienced myself is that once you become more aware of these kind of perceptual faculties, you see them around you a lot more, so if you become sensitized to them, you become more attuned to picking up on things like this in the environment. So it's just a question of being aware of your environment and looking for stuff that you can kind of deploy in an artistic context to some kind of political effect, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, cool. Thank you so much. Yeah.
I mean, I've been maybe, I'm sort of intentionally a little bit cynical about some of the kind of uses to which, EVP stuff's been put in the art world, but, sort of counterbalance that by saying that these kind of projective and imaginative techniques are enormously powerful for generating artworks, and remain so, and will never not be enormously powerful,
I'm not sure how to ask this question, so I'm going to fumble my way through it, but how are you... I get the impression from the talk today that a lot of this is quite from a Western science background of proving things.
Yeah.
Where does it stand then if you're talking about things which are spiritual, which for many cultures and many people is not then in that case dismissive of what the vast majority in terms of time and space, like people are spiritual?
Yeah.
Well, how do you go about doing that sensitively and also keeping open to the possibility that there might be spirituality?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not trying to be sort of rude to anybody, particularly in relation to EVP. I think the issue is that, a lot of people who get interested in it, some people are just kind of like looking for something weird and unusual and it's a bit of a laugh sort of thing, but equally there are a lot of people who are bereaved, right? So, you need to sort of tread gently around that. There's a book called The Oxford Companion to the Mind, edited by experimental psychologist Richard Gregory, and there's a section on bereavement in there, and it says during bereavement sights and sounds are commonly misperceived as being evidence of the return of the bereaved, and I've experienced that myself, where you see or hear things that you think are your deceased friend or relative, coming back, and you've got to tread gently around that. The other end of the spectrum is that some of the people, not all of the people, but some of the people that are involved in the EVP scene are just blatantly taking the piss and are really trying to exploit bereaved people, and actually trying to make money out of other people's bereavement. There's a big spectrum. different motives, often quite confused in between. And there are some particularly egregious examples of kind of, quack practitioners who are kind of trying to exploit, public ignorance of sort of, these kind of issues to their own advantage. In terms of kind of religious stuff, it's these kind of perceptions, as I said, are a powerful factor in animism, and a lot of kind of more towards the kind of pagan end of the spectrum of religious beliefs. And I talked about rock formations in I guess it would be what do you call it? You have kind of Bon in Tibet, but there's also in Japan. What's animism in Japan called? Can't remember. Anyway, animistic beliefs in Japan. Shinto, there's a big element in kind of Shinto and stuff like that. I find a lot of that kind of stuff extremely endearing, and very moving, because it reflects the kind of human priorities in perception, that you want to see things that, you want to see a personality in the natural, the soul operating within the natural world, the sort of agency of, to some extent it's a sort of sentimental projection, perhaps, arguably, but equally it's one that helps people to actually cope with the world that they make sense of and cope with the world in which they live, So, I think there's, that personally, I find a lot of that kind of stuff very interesting. And while I've talked about, say, Tibet and Japan, but I mean, in England, a traditional thing in, what you might call pagan beliefs. The word pagan in Latin just means countryside, I think. So, it doesn't, it's not paganism in the sense that we understand paganism as a sort of semi-organised religion today, but more paganism as in it was like the folk beliefs of the people who lived out in the countryside, as opposed to the beliefs of people who lived in the towns and cities. Where my mum grew up, these kind of beliefs were still strongly in evidence in Wiltshire in the 1940s and 1950s, let alone, hundreds of years ago, kind of like folk magic and stuff like that. But in England, a really good example of this would be the Green Man, which is the image where you see, like a human face emerging out of leaves, and it basically looks like a Rorschach ink blot test, So, and that's very similar to where, you have kind of temples in Japan, which, are dedicated to sort of anthropomorphic rocks and stuff like that. I think it's really interesting,
Well, thank you all for the questions. We've got to wrap up now, but I just wanted to throw in from Harrietta again regarding the Dream Machine. There's one at the Tate at the moment in the Electric Dreams exhibition.
Yeah.
Saya's nodding. But for everyone else. And Joe, are you performing National Grid again? And would you like to plug anything that's upcoming just as we wrap up?
I'm actually, it's going to be quite low key, but I'm performing on Sunday.
Daniel Freeman has already found it on your website. 100 Years Gallery.
100 Years Gallery, yeah. It's 2:30 in the afternoon, I think. So, get this nice matinee performance. Yeah.
Brilliant. And is that as part of Disinformation?
Yeah.
Or? Okay.
Yeah,
brilliant.
I'm going to be collaborating with saxophonist. Mike Walter. Yeah.
Lovely.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Joe, for your
cheers, my
talk.
pleasure.
Thank you, everyone, for the questions. And please join us next week for Ian Bailey.